You don't want your story about selling your business to become a negative case study on my next broadcast. So we're going to talk about some lease tips that you can apply if you are selling your business. Selling your business? Stand by for some very important lease tips. But first, I want to share a story with you. I was speaking at the California Restaurant Show. A restaurant owner came up to me and said, "Dale, I've sold my restaurant 5 times. I said, "How in the world did you sell your restaurant 5 times? He said, "The first 4 times, the landlord rejected the buyer." He was mad, of course, as he should be. The 5th time he found a buyer, he had to go through the court system, and a judge forced the landlord to accept the buyer as the new tenant. You don't want your story about selling your business to become a negative case study on my next broadcast. So we're going to talk about some lease tips that you can apply if you are selling your business. I'm Dale Willerton, the Lease Coach. For a complimentary copy of my 4 Dummies book, go to theleasecoach.com and tell me your story. If you're selling your business, the landlord is going to draft a 2 to 3 page lease assignment agreement. They may call it a transfer agreement. Whether your lease agreement calls it an assignment or a transfer, they are synonymous, the same thing. About 90% of leases will call it an assignment, 10% will call it a transfer. Either way, the landlord will draft a 2 to 3 page document for both the buyer and the seller and the landlord to sign to make the transfer process official. At the Lease Coach, we frequently are hired by tenants who are selling their business. They want a professional to handle their lease assignment so that all the details are covered and they are protected. This is a very, very normal process for us. So as an existing business owner, the very first thing you're going to do or ask us to do is review your lease document and zero in on the assignment clause. That's one of the most important clauses in your lease agreement, the assignment clause. This is where it's going to say what conditions apply when you sell the business. Now, it's pretty rare to come across a lease agreement that doesn't have an assignment clause, but 98% of the time they're worded so one-sided for the landlord that they can really, kibosh your deal and force you to go back and look for another buyer and look for another buyer, and you don't want that to happen. So when you review the lease agreement, what you're looking for are these words: landlord consent not to be unreasonably withheld. That should be in the assignment clause. However, most of the time it actually says the landlord may withhold its consent at the landlord's sole discretion. That's not good for you. That is not what you want. Understand that the landlord may not be excited that you're selling your business. In fact, some landlords actually feel like they're being jilted or left behind. "Oh, you've been here for 15 years, you built up your company, and now you're leaving me." A landlord can react that way and not always be cooperative. Remember, to a landlord, if you've been paying your rent on time and running a good business, and then you assign the lease agreement, at best, that's a lateral move for the landlord. They're just getting paid rent by somebody else, right? It's not an improvement for them. So you're all excited and you're pumped to be selling your business and retiring or moving on, and the landlord might be, kind of negative or take his time, and that often happens. There's not much you can do about it, but realize the landlord's not going to sing and dance with you because you found a buyer for your restaurant and you're ready to retire. You will probably decide whether your sale of your business is going to be an asset sale or you're selling the shares in your company. 95% of the time it's an asset sale, and the landlord will ask about that. It's very common for the landlord to have an application that they will expect the buyer to fill out. They'll want to see the financial information on the buyer. They might ask you questions like, does this buyer have any experience in this industry? And maybe they don't, and that might scare the landlord. You might be a professional baker and you're running a bake shop, or you might be a dentist and you're running a dental office. Well, a baker could sell his bakery to anybody, right? Good baker, bad baker, no baker. A dentist is going to sell to another dentist. A chiropractor is going to sell to another chiropractor. Those are easier assignments to slip into the deal. It's very important to look in that assignment clause in your lease agreement for a fee. On the low side, it's about $500. On the high side, it's about $2,500 for you to, a one-time fee that you're paying to the landlord. It's non-refundable, and this is the fee they're taking from you to make sure you're serious, and for their time and energy processing and vetting the applicant and doing up the lease assignment agreement for them. So sometimes a tenant will call me up and say, Dale, I've been talking to my landlord for 2 months about my lease assignment and they just don't seem to be taking any action. I've got a buyer over here and he's getting really antsy. It's taking too long. And I said, have you paid the fee? And they say, well, what do you mean paid the fee? I said, well, there's a fee in your lease agreement. He says, well, I thought I paid that later. I said, no, technically the clock doesn't start ticking until you pay that fee. In the landlord's mind, you have not made a formal application to assign your lease agreement until that fee has been received by them, whether they told you or not. So that could be your hang up if it's taking way too long. Most landlords, in my experience, will also ask for a copy of the purchase sale agreement for the business. They want to see, not so much the nuts and bolts, they want to see how much you're selling it for. Is your business worth $750,000, but you've convinced someone to pay you $1.5 million? The landlord may not like to see that if they think you're gouging or selling it for too much. They want to know that the buyer who's taking the lease assignment can actually pay his loan to the bank and pay the rent at the same time. Either through you or directly through the buyer, the landlord will want to see some personal financial information on the buyer. Usually a personal net worth statement if they don't have any business experience, but if they do, like for example, I do a lot of work for a UPS courier. It's very common for a multi-unit UPS franchisee to buy another unit. Well, he's already proven in the system. The landlord can't find a better tenant to take over that lease agreement because he already owns a couple of UPS stores and he knows how to operate them. His chance of success is much higher than someone just stepping into the franchise system for the first time. It's very common for a tenant to say to me, Dale, should I assign my current lease agreement or should we have a brand new lease for the buyer to sign on his own? The landlord has some control over which way this process goes. Sometimes they're flexible, but they will usually decide. And of course, there is a third option. Instead of just assigning the existing lease agreement with whatever term is left, or starting a brand new lease agreement, we can do a lease assignment and amending, or a lease assignment and extension agreement. So we do a lease assignment, but then we add 3 more years or 6 more years to the term. So there's no requirement for another long document. You're still using the 30, 40, 50 page formal lease agreement the seller had. You're just doing a 2 to 3 page lease amending or lease assignment and amending document. In the purchase agreement, it's very common for you to disclose or state that you have a certain amount of deposit with the landlord. And in my experience with buyers and sellers, sometimes they pre-agree. The buyer says, look, I'll just transfer you my deposit. We'll let the landlord keep my deposit and work that way. But that's up to the landlord, not up to you. The landlord may indeed refund the seller's deposit and collect a new deposit from the buyer. Sometimes the landlord will agree to assign the deposit they're already holding, but a lot of them like to clean their books off. They like to do the refund and then collect a new deposit. And don't be surprised if the buyer is asked to pay a higher deposit than you are, right? The deposit is a security deposit. You may be no risk to the landlord doesn't know that about the buyer. One of the potential obstacles you will encounter is not having enough runway or enough term left on your lease. So let's say it's a 5-year lease, you're in year 3 and you want to sell. So the buyer is going to take over the last 2 years of your term. But the buyer wants a 5-year loan, right? The bank is going to say, well, we'll only give you a loan for the period of the lease term you have left, right? So the bank says, yeah, we'll loan you the money, but you have to pay us back over 2 years because that's all that's left on the lease. That's one of the reasons we will actually often add 3 more years to the term or add another renewal option so that the buyer has more runway, they can get a longer loan payment plan and now afford to be able to buy your business. Many business owners have given a personal guarantee for their company, right? The company or the LLC is the tenant. The tenant has signed the lease agreement, but the owner of that company is given a personal guarantee. When I negotiate a lease from scratch in the beginning, we will try to envision or anticipate that sometime in the future this business is going to sell. And if we have to give a personal guarantee, we want the landlord to permit the buyer's guarantee to replace the seller's guarantee. We don't want them both to be there. We don't want them to overlap. All right? So if you're negotiating a lease for the first time, that's a good thing to negotiate now. But if that's already in your lease agreement, like I'm a magnet for tenants with problems and they come to me and I say, why did you agree to that? And why did you sign this? And so on. Chances are your personal guarantee is going to be there and we're going to have to negotiate with the landlord for the buyer's guarantee to replace your guarantee. They might say, well, we need a 6-month overlap or a 1-year overlap, but the landlord should not require both guarantees in perpetuity. Many sophisticated lease agreements have made certain rights or privileges personal to the original tenant. So for example, when you assign your lease agreement, the renewal option clause may not transfer to the buyer. The exclusivity, right, may not transfer to the buyer. These are things the landlord may have put into the lease agreement that were personal for you. And so you have to go back and revisit that and renegotiate that so that the entire process does go forward. The buyer knows you have an exclusivity for certain products. He's going to want that as well when he buys the business. It's not uncommon for a tenant with a checkered past to come to me and say, yeah, I've missed a few rent payments. It was pretty hairy around the pandemic, but I'm current today and I want to sell my business. I found a buyer and I want to assign my lease agreement. There's a good chance the landlord will look into their historical rent roll, look into their historical files and say, no, when you went into default, when you owed us rent money, even though you're current today, that act of default has now eliminated your right to assign the lease agreement. We don't have to do anything with you whatsoever. That's another good reason to find out from the landlord in advance. Okay, is this something that's going to hold me up? Because I know I missed a couple of payments around the pandemic, but I caught them up and everything's good now. You need to find that out. When I'm negotiating a lease for a franchise tenant, we add a special clause in that says, if one franchisee sells the business to another franchisee, the landlord cannot withhold their consent. In fact, consent is not even required, only notification. In other words, if I'm doing a lease assignment for a Firehouse Substore, then as long as the store is staying a Firehouse Subs, as long as to the public there don't appear to be any changes, the landlord should not be able to say no to that because both of you, the buyer and the seller, have been approved as Firehouse Subs franchisees. So the franchisee has a little bit more leverage, especially if they've been doing well and you're a desirable brand. If you're selling a business, either you're selling it on your own, you're using a business broker, or perhaps a real estate agent. It's important to be careful that if you're using a real estate agent, they don't use this as an opportunity to collect a commission from the landlord, that they don't sell your tenancy, the buyer's tenancy, to the landlord. If the landlord is being charged any commissions whatsoever, they're going to charge it back to the tenants. So be careful of that. This could be going on behind the scenes. You know the real estate agent's getting paid a commission to sell your business, but you didn't know that he demanded a commission from the landlord on the new 5 or 10-year lease agreement the buyer's going to sign. I'm going to close this segment with a story, not one that you're going to want to hear. It broke my heart, but franchise tenant reaches out to me. Here's our story. Over a year ago, we sold both of our franchises and assigned our lease agreements to a buyer. For the first 6 months, he paid the rent and we never heard from anybody. We'd gone off into the horizon. We were on retirement. It's an industry norm for the seller of a business, the assignor, to remain responsible on the lease agreement if the assignee, the buyer, does not actually pay the rent. That's actually pretty normal. We try to negotiate to make that go away or reduce the risk, but it's common. Landlords expect it, tenants often agree to it. So for the first 5 or 6 months, they never heard a thing. They'd been paid for the businesses, they were in retirement, life was good. Then they get a letter from the landlord saying, hey, you owe us 5 months of rent. And they, well, what do you mean we owe you 5? Well, the buyer is not paying the rent. In fact, he's like 4 or 5 months behind, and you have to catch it up because you assigned the lease agreement to him and you agreed to be responsible if he did not pay the rent. So this couple fortunately had accumulated some wealth, and they thought, well, we'll just pay this 5 months of rent. We'll clean up all the rent arrears, and then we'll get back into the space and get the business restarted, because the business had closed now. Get the business restarted and then sell it again or transfer it again. And the landlord said, hold on here. You don't get possession of the space back. That wasn't part of our agreement. Our agreement was you would pay the rent if the buyer didn't pay the rent. And the buyer's not paying the rent. The buyer's gone. So the seller was required to pay the rent. They could not get back into the space and reset up the business. So they were basically at the landlord's mercy for a period of time until the landlord on their own found a replacement tenant, and then they negotiated some kind of settlement. You don't want that scenario to play out on you, and it could. So you really want to pay attention to this. Ideally, you're paying attention to the assignment clause when you're negotiating your first lease, but you can also make amending changes to it when you're negotiating a lease renewal. We do it for tenants all the time. So if you have any questions about lease assignments or lease transfers, reach out to the Lease Coach. We will guide you, we will help you, or even just give you some free advice on the phone. I'm Dale Willerton, the Lease Coach. We help tenants.